Since the outbreak of COVID-19, there have been billions of dollars spent in research and development of a vaccine. But can we trust what's produced? And when it is developed in such a rush, can we really trust the whole process and those who are developing it? Josh Morrison is the co-founder and executive director of One Day Sooner, an organization that advocates on behalf of COVID-19 challenge trial volunteers. Welcome to BCN, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Now, earlier this year, you were looking for volunteers for human trials to find a COVID-19 vaccine. What has the response been like?
Well, it's been really incredible. So our organization advocates for human challenge volunteers, which is a special type of test for vaccines or treatments that actually involves deliberately exposing people to infection. And so that's unusual, and we haven't been doing that yet, though there are several groups that are developing these trials. So we've had over 36,000 people in 160 countries who've said that they would be interested in being in these human challenge trials, and I'm one of those people.
So what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria for each participant?
So no trial has been officially approved yet. So what I'm about to say is a prediction, and it's not, we don't know for sure. But I think the first trials are going to be really restricted of a challenge trial for COVID-19. So the World Health Organization gave some recommendations, and they said that the first trial should have people only who are 18 to 25 and in really excellent health. And I'm actually 35, so that would mean that I wouldn't be able to participate. No, I think based on what the risks are, I think 18 to 40 might be a better idea than 18 to 25, but I would expect that the first of these human challenge trials are probably going to be restricted to 18 to 25 or possibly 18 to 30.
How about human challenge trials involving maybe seniors, people over the age of 65?
So I think that that's unlikely to happen unless, at least at first, I think the world where something like that would happen would be a world where we have very effective treatments and we're testing a vaccine that we think is going to be very effective. And even then, I think it'd be unlikely. And that's because the risks, a disease that has significant risks at any age, and it can kill people at any age. But someone who's, something like age 20 to 30, their chance of dying if they're infected by COVID might be 1 in 15,000, for example. But the risk of someone who's over 80, their risk could be 10%. So the risk goes up exponentially. And so I think that's why it's such a restricted age range. And I do think for the foreseeable future, certainly for the next 6 months, we shouldn't expect to see people older than say 50, certainly older than 60, be in such a challenge trial.
So Josh, once the volunteers have been infected, where do they go to be isolated? Is it at home or maybe a special facility?
No, it's at a special facility, and that's to make sure that no one who hasn't consented to being exposed to infection is getting infected in this trial. So it's in biocontainment facilities that have a very high standard of biosecurity. So there's only a certain number of those facilities that exist throughout the world. Something like 60 of them are in the US, maybe 20 or so in Europe. I believe Canada has 1 or 2 of them that would be suitable for this purpose. So it's going to be a special facility, and that's where the exposure to the infection would take place. It would be in kind of a nasal dropper, kind of like an eyedropper with the virus for your nose, and then you would go right from that to this isolation, where you would be for probably something like 2 to 3 weeks until it was very certain that you were no longer infectious.
How much of a health risk, however, are these volunteers being exposed to?
Well, so I think that what I would say is that it's meaningful, and it's definitely a risk that no one should take lightly, or that no one should, try at home or something like that. But at the same time, it's, by all the data we have, is a lower risk than risk that we let people accept in other circumstances. Like, for example, kidney donation, which is about a 1 in 3,300 chance of death, or childbirth, which in the United States is about a 1 in 6,500 chance of death. And so by comparison, like I said, for that young population, that might be 1 in 14,000. And then that's, if you take out the unhealthy people, it would be lower. So there is real uncertainty about COVID. But, by everything that we know, it's the type of risk we let people accept in other circumstances.
To what degree could the human challenge trials potentially speed up the timeline to get a vaccine?
So I think that we have to think about two different vaccines. The first thing to know is that it's going to take some time to set up the human challenge trials. You need to do what's called an infectious dosing study first. So I don't think we'll be testing vaccines before the end of the year, or maybe at the very tail end of this year, we might be able to start testing vaccines. Once you can start testing them, you can, from the time you start infecting the person to the time you get a result, could be as little as a month. So you could really learn a lot. And that's not, you need to still test a vaccine in thousands of people so that you can make sure that they're safe. But that early signal of effectiveness could be very helpful and could speed up deployment by months. Now, that's probably not going to be soon enough for the candidates that are already being tested in these enormous phase 3s, like Moderna's or Oxford's or Pfizer's. But for other things like Merck's or Johnson & Johnson, or all of the more than 100 vaccines that are in development, challenge trials could be crucial to getting that second generation of vaccines that will hopefully be, instead of maybe 60% effective like the first ones likely to be, might be 80 or 90% effective, or might not require a booster shot, might be easier to distribute, things like that.
Now, part of the debate is whether it is ethical to intentionally infect someone with COVID-19. What are your thoughts?
So first, the important thing to know, and something I didn't really know before I started doing this work, is we do these types of infection studies in other contexts. We do infection studies for malaria and flu and RSV, which is another respiratory disease, dengue fever, typhoid, and cholera. So this isn't unique. Now, what is unusual is for most of those diseases, not for flu and not for RSV, but for malaria and typhoid and cholera, we have drug treatments that we can feel confident, once you take that treatment, you're not going to, it's very unlikely to die of malaria, which we don't have yet for COVID. One of the ways this could be useful is helping to test some of those therapies to get better treatments and therapies. But I think the difference here is that, COVID is more dangerous. But the fact that it's a global pandemic makes the value of this research all the higher. And so, the name of our organization is One Day Sooner, is the idea that right now something like 4,000 to 5,000 people around the world are dying each day of COVID. Now, it's likely that if you did these challenge studies in 1,000 people, no one would die. And if you could even save one day of deployment of a vaccine, or end the shortage, or end the crisis one day sooner, that represents thousands of lives saved, and that's an enormous benefit for willing volunteers who understand the risks to participate in studies to achieve.
Josh, what really motivates somebody to take this on? They're not being paid. We're talking about volunteering, correct?
So, usually in challenge studies, people do get paid for participation. Most of the volunteers who've signed up, in our study, basically, what we've said is, look, you're going to need reimbursement for lost wages and expenses. You're going to need to make sure that people's long-term health that there's long-term follow-up and things like that. But that's not people's motivation is to be paid. People have different motivations. Not 36,000 people aren't all going to think the same thing. But I think, what a lot of people say, and that's something that I feel, is a desire to feel empowered to be fighting this virus and to be doing something useful during this terrible pandemic. That's a really strong motivation. And I think people also talk about, wanting to protect their friends and family is another reason people do this. And a lot of people have a deep, or volunteers or people who are part of the medical field or the biomedical field. They know about these studies. They know more about this, and they want to be contributing to science and be part of the solution and not just be passively accepting what's happening.
Let's talk about what's happening in other countries around the world when it comes to a potential vaccine for COVID-19. Josh, Russia's come out in August. They declared that they had approved a vaccine for COVID-19. And in Israel as well, they're talking about some of their labs. They're fairly close as well. Have you had an opportunity to be involved in either of those?
So we definitely haven't been involved. And I would say about the Russian vaccine, it's easy to approve a vaccine if you don't wait to see if it works or not, right? Because there's a number of vaccines that have evidence that they cause an immune response. But we don't know if that immune response is actually going to translate to reduced infection. And we also, you need to test a vaccine in thousands of people to make sure that it's safe before you can really deploy it. And I think those steps are important. And so I do think that, by all accounts, what Russia is doing is misguided and overly hasty. I also think there's been recent indications that some of the data they've been using that have been published, even in very small studies that they've published, or maybe have some issues with them as well. So I do think that, yes, we all want a vaccine, and we certainly want a vaccine soon, but we want something that has really strong scientific evidence and that we can feel confident in giving to the public.
Can you explain how the process actually works as well? Developed in the lab, and then when you go to trials, do you start off with mice, maybe make your way up to pigs, monkeys, before you make your way to human beings? How does that work?
Yeah, so usually, so I'll first kind of start with the way things usually work, and then how things are maybe a little different for COVID because of the urgency. So
Right.
usually you would test a vaccine in what's called an animal model. So in a chimpanzee, I think what I lately the best animal model for COVID in some ways is actually supposed to be Syrian hamsters,
Oh,
apparently. So usually you test in the animal, then you could do what's called an animal challenge. So you give the virus to the animal, and after giving the vaccine, and then if that looks like it works, you test maybe in 30 or 40 people in what's called a phase 1 study to make sure that any huge safety issues that you can spot that right away. And if that looks good, you expand out to maybe 100 people or so, maybe a bit more, in a phase 2 study, which is testing both that level of safety in a different population, maybe testing a couple different doses, and then also is testing for what's called immunogenicity. Does it generate an immune response? And then finally, if that all looks good, then you would go to these what's called phase 3 of testing in thousands or tens of thousands of people. And that's both what you do there is what's called a randomized control trial. You take half of your people in the group who are tested, and you give them the vaccine, and you take half and give them a placebo. And then you see, do the people who get the vaccine, do they have fewer infections rather than the placebo? And you just have to wait for people to get infected naturally. And so, you need something like maybe a couple hundred infections throughout your study to have a decent sense of if a vaccine would work if it was going to be about 50% effective. You might need a few fewer infections if it was less than that. Now, the difference with COVID is these things are moving much faster. So a lot of these vaccines that are being tested, they didn't start with the animal model before they went into humans. They did those two things simultaneously. Or, if you look at the Oxford study, Oxford, which is all the drug that's going to be produced by AstraZeneca, that was the first drug to get into phase 3 studies. So in some ways, they're moving the quickest. And they combined their phase 1 and phase 2 study, and then they also combined a phase 2 and phase 3 study. So these things are kind of compressed, and things are moving a lot faster than they normally would.
Josh, some people suggest that intentionally infecting healthy volunteers with low doses of the COVID-19 virus could help create herd immunity, which could then potentially make the pandemic easier to maintain or manage. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so first I'll say that's not our position. That's not what we're trying to accomplish. Our organization is trying to test the drugs and vaccines by doing this. This idea, I generally, basically think that trying to deliberately infect people just as a way of getting herd immunity, I would worry about that for two reasons. First, for the safety of the people who are being infected directly, but more importantly, because I don't know if then they would spread it to other people who aren't going to be safe. And of course, anyone who's trying this, I'm sure they would say, well, look, we're going to isolate effectively, but you can't know that. And I think that there are reasons to be I think it's good to be thinking of creative solutions, but I also think it's good to be scientifically driven. I think the better way, there's an interesting article in the New England Journal of Medicine recently that talks about how people wearing masks frequently in social distancing might reduce the viral load that the average person who is infected is getting, and might therefore lead to less severe disease. So I would say that generally people should be wearing masks, doing their social distancing. If that means then that the people that are infected are getting lower doses and are more safe, that's a good thing. I would be very skeptical of the idea of deliberately infecting people just so they'd have immunity in the future, in part because we don't know what the immunity is going to look like, how long it's going to last, and what effects it might have. That's actually a good reason to do challenge studies. Is one thing we're working on is to develop a reinfection study to challenge people who've already been infected by the virus, and that can help us understand the immune response better and better guide some of these social policy questions.
Do you work with only certain companies to test their vaccines?
So our organization, again, like I said, there's no studies that have been approved yet to test a vaccine with a challenge study. Oxford has said they're interested in doing challenge studies, though that might just be to create the model to do the infectious dosing study, not necessarily for their own vaccine. Our group advocates on behalf of challenge volunteers. That's our goal. And so basically what I think Challenge volunteers want is to get the most and best vaccines developed and available for people around the world, throughout, but regardless of what country they're a part of or how much they earn or anything like that. And so, we want to be helping any vaccine developer that could find this useful. So we do collaborate and discuss some of these things with particular manufacturers or trialists. We've had discussion, we have collaborative discussions with Oxford, like I mentioned, but also with the NIH and Johnson and Johnson. But we're definitely willing to work with any group that's developing vaccines to try to get great and effective and useful challenge studies to move things forward as quickly as possible.
Josh Morrison, co-founder and executive director of One Day Sooner. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you.